Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. What if I told you the United States doubled in size overnight, for just 4 cents an acre? It sounds unbelievable, almost like a plot twist in a historical drama, but it's true. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase transformed the map of North America and the future of a young United States. With a single stroke of a pen, over 828,000 square miles of land, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, were transferred from France to the U.S. It was one of the greatest land deals in history, and yet, it almost didn't happen. At the time, France was in a difficult position. Napoleon Bonaparte, obsessed with his European campaigns, was desperate for funds to continue his wars. His dream of building a vast empire in the Americas had been shattered after a devastating loss in Haiti, where enslaved people rose up and overthrew French colonial rule. The once valuable colony had cost France dearly, both in lives and resources. Suddenly, Louisiana, a massive underdeveloped territory France had reclaimed from Spain just a few years earlier, seemed more like a liability than an asset. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States, under President Thomas Jefferson, was facing its own challenges. The Mississippi River was the lifeblood of American commerce, especially for farmers and traders in the West. New Orleans, located at the mouth of the river, was under French control, and there were growing concerns that access to this vital port could be restricted at any moment. Jefferson initially authorized his envoys to negotiate the purchase of just New Orleans and a small strip of surrounding land for up to $10 million. But fate had other plans. When American diplomats James Monroe and Robert Livingston arrived in Paris, they were met with a surprising offer. Napoleon, eager to cut his losses in the New World and raise money for his military ambitions, proposed selling not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory. All of it. For $15 million, the American envoys were stunned. This was far beyond what they were authorized to negotiate, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. They quickly agreed, and the Louisiana Purchase was signed on April 30, 1803. Just like that, the United States doubled in size. But this deal raised big questions. Could the federal government even purchase new land according to the Constitution? Jefferson himself, a strict constitutionalist, wrestled with the legality of the move. In the end, he chose pragmatism over ideology, justifying the purchase as a treaty-making power of the executive branch. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just add land, it changed the nation's destiny. It sparked westward expansion, opened new trade routes, and ignited debates over slavery and Native American displacement that would shape the country for generations. It was a bold gamble, driven by urgency, ambition, and a bit of luck. And it all came down to a moment when the interests of two very different nations happened to align. In 1803, something extraordinary happened. The United States, still a relatively young and growing republic, pulled off one of the greatest real estate deals in world history, the Louisiana Purchase. This was a monumental land agreement between the United States and France, in which the U.S. acquired an enormous territory, 828,000 square miles, for just $15 million. That's about 4 cents an acre. The land stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, covering parts of what are now 15 different states. At its core, the Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a land deal, it was a turning point in American history. For the U.S., it meant more than doubling its territory, gaining control of crucial trade routes, and securing vast natural resources. It opened the door for westward expansion, laying the groundwork for what would become the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand from coast to coast. But this deal also helped shape the American identity. It pushed the boundaries of what the United States could become, both geographically and politically. It sparked debates about power, land ownership, slavery, and the future of Native American nations already living on that land. And it marked a key moment when America began to truly see itself as a continental power, ready to grow beyond its original 13 colonies. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a transaction, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the American story. Before the Louisiana Purchase reshaped the map of North America, the vast territory at its center had already changed hands multiple times. and each transfer reflected the global power struggles of the time. Originally claimed by France, in the 17th century the land was ceded to Spain in 1762 after France's defeat in the 7 Years' War. For decades, Spain governed the Louisiana Territory, though sparsely, and mostly used it as a buffer zone between its more lucrative holdings in Mexico and the expanding British colonies to the east. But by the turn of the 19th century, the global balance of power was shifting fast. Napoleon Bonaparte had risen to power in France and was dreaming of a grand French empire, not only in Europe but in the Americas as well. In 1800, through the secret Treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain agreed to return Louisiana to France, though the transfer remained mostly on paper and out of public knowledge for a few years. Napoleon planned to use the territory to supply his Caribbean colonies, especially the immensely profitable island of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars were escalating. France was locked in near constant warfare with Britain and other European powers. These conflicts consumed massive resources, drained the French treasury, and forced Napoleon to reconsider the practicality of maintaining distant colonies in the Americas. Across the Atlantic, the United States was keeping a close eye on these developments. President Thomas Jefferson and American settlers were particularly concerned about access to the Mississippi River, a vital artery for trade. Goods from the interior of the country had to travel down the river to reach the port of New Orleans, which was still technically under Spanish control, but would soon become French territory. When Spain briefly revoked American trading rights, in New Orleans in 1802, it caused immediate panic. Western farmers feared economic ruin, and Jefferson feared a potential military conflict with a European power. The stakes were high. Control of the Mississippi and New Orleans wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was essential for the economic survival of the growing western frontier. With tensions rising and French control looming, the United States realized it had to act. What started as a mission to secure a single port would soon turn into a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change the shape of a nation. By 1803, President Thomas Jefferson was dealing with a significant geopolitical dilemma. The port of New Orleans, located at the mouth of the Mississippi River, was an essential gateway for the movement of goods from the American heartland. For farmers in the Western territories, particularly those west of the Appalachian Mountains, the river was the primary route for transporting crops, especially grain and tobacco, to international markets. The Mississippi River connected the western frontier to the Gulf of Mexico, making New Orleans not only an important trade hub, but a vital lifeline for American commerce. In 1800, France, under Napoleon Bonaparte, had reacquired the Louisiana Territory from Spain through a secret treaty. The French were now in control of the port of New Orleans. Jefferson, who had always championed American independence and the expansion of Republican ideals, was deeply concerned that a return to French control of this crucial port would endanger American economic interests. France, a powerful European nation, could potentially impose restrictive policies or even close the port to American shipping, effectively crippling the economy of the western states. For Jefferson, who valued the country's economic autonomy, this was an unacceptable threat. With the Mississippi River being so vital to the young nation's survival, Jefferson saw the possibility of French control over New Orleans as a major strategic challenge. If the port was closed or controlled by a foreign power, it could cut off American farmers from crucial international markets, leading to economic stagnation and even political unrest. The situation was made even more precarious by the fact that the United States had only recently secured its independence from Britain, and Jefferson feared that any foreign control over a key trade route could rekindle tensions and undermine the hard-won freedom of the young republic. As the situation unfolded, Jefferson's administration faced increasing pressure to secure access to New Orleans and the Mississippi River. In an effort to safeguard American interests, Jefferson instructed his diplomats to negotiate with France and Spain for control of the port. At the same time, he was concerned that any diplomatic failure might lead to military conflict. Ultimately, in 1803, Jefferson and his diplomats managed to negotiate the purchase of the entire Louisiana Territory from France, in what became known as the Louisiana Purchase. This acquisition not only ensured American control over New Orleans and the Mississippi River, but also doubled the size of the United States, opening vast new territories for settlement and trade. However, the purchase also raised questions about the constitutional authority of the president, as Jefferson had to grapple with the tension between his strict interpretation of the Constitution and the need for executive flexibility in the face of national security concerns. Thus, by 1803, Jefferson's concerns over the port of New Orleans and the Mississippi River highlighted the strategic importance of these waterways for the survival of the United States. His successful negotiation of the Louisiana Purchase resolved the immediate crisis, but also set the stage for further territorial expansion and the challenges that would come with integrating new lands into the growing republic. To preempt this threat, Jefferson authorized an urgent diplomatic mission. He instructed Robert Livingston, the U.S. minister to France, to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans and nearby lands for up to $10 million. Jefferson wasn't looking for empire, he was looking for access. He believed securing this one key port would be enough to guarantee American economic independence in the West. But there was a problem. Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government should only do what the Constitution explicitly allowed. And nowhere in the Constitution was there a clear provision for the federal government to purchase foreign land. Even as he gave instructions to explore a deal, Jefferson wrestled with the legality of what he was doing. Could he go beyond the letter of the law if it meant protecting the future of the Republic? While Thomas Jefferson and his diplomats were preparing to negotiate the fate of New Orleans, the international landscape was changing rapidly, particularly in Europe and the Caribbean. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had recently risen to prominence as the ruler of France, harbored grand ambitions of rebuilding France's colonial empire in the Americas. His vision included not only reasserting French dominance in the Caribbean, but also reclaiming territories lost during the 7 Years' War and expanding France's influence in the Western Hemisphere. A crucial part of his plans was the revitalization of French colonies, including Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, which was considered one of the wealthiest colonies in the world at the time, due to its thriving sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans. Napoleon's success in executing these ambitions, however, would be severely hindered by unforeseen events in the Caribbean. In 1791, a massive slave revolt broke out in Saint-Domingue, igniting a struggle that would evolve into the Haitian Revolution. The insurgents, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, sought to end the brutal system of slavery and gain independence from French colonial rule. This revolution quickly became one of the most significant in world history, not only because it led to the establishment of the first independent Black Republic, but also because it would undermine Napoleon's imperial aspirations in the Americas. Initially, Napoleon attempted to regain control of the island and restore slavery, sending his brother-in-law Charles Leclerc along with a large military force to put down the revolution. However, they were met with fierce resistance from the Haitian revolutionaries, who were fighting for their freedom. The situation worsened as yellow fever, a deadly tropical disease, ravaged the French forces, decimating their ranks. After several years of brutal fighting, and with Napoleon's military tied down in the Caribbean, the French forces were decisively defeated by the Haitian rebels in 1803. The failure in Saint-Domingue had far-reaching consequences. With his Caribbean ambitions crushed, Napoleon was forced to rethink his plans for the Americas. He realized that maintaining a French presence in North America was no longer practical, especially considering the logistical challenges and the growing strength of the United States. The loss of Saint-Domingue also meant that Napoleon could no longer rely on the profits from the Caribbean to finance his military campaigns in Europe. At this point, Napoleon's focus shifted. Rather than trying to maintain French control over the Louisiana Territory, he saw an opportunity to strengthen France's position by selling it to the United States. The Louisiana Territory, with its vast expanse of fertile land and strategic position, had become more of a liability than an asset for Napoleon. With his plans for empire in the Americas dashed, he was eager to raise funds for his ongoing wars in Europe and saw the United States as a willing buyer. The prospect of selling the land to the Americans allowed him to rid himself of a troublesome and costly territory, while simultaneously forging a strategic relationship with the growing American Republic. Thus, the events unfolding in the Caribbean, particularly the defeat of the French in Saint-Domingue, had a direct impact on the fate of the Louisiana Territory. Napoleon's shifting priorities in the wake of his failure in the Caribbean paved the way for the Louisiana Purchase, which would change the trajectory of both France and the United States. By 1803, the political and military realities of Europe and the Caribbean had combined to create the perfect conditions for the United States to acquire one of the most valuable pieces of land in history, ensuring access to New Orleans and securing its economic future. In 1791, Saint-Domingue, France's richest colony located on the island of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, was swept by a massive slave revolt led by the brilliant and determined Toussaint Louverture. The enslaved population, fueled by the ideals of the French Revolution and their desire for freedom, rose up against their French masters. What followed was a brutal and protracted war, with France desperately attempting to maintain control. Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, to crush the rebellion and restore French rule. But despite massive military reinforcements, the French forces were defeated by both the revolutionaries and the devastating effects of yellow fever, which decimated their ranks. By 1803, Napoleon had no choice but to abandon his plans for an empire in the Americas. Saint-Domingue had been lost, and the French dream of controlling the Western Hemisphere had crumbled. Napoleon's attention turned back to Europe, where his wars of conquest were draining France's resources. He was in desperate need of funds to finance his military campaigns against Britain and other European powers. The lucrative, yet distant Louisiana Territory, once seen as vital for the Caribbean colonies, was now a burden, an expensive, largely undeveloped piece of land that France could not afford to defend. In this dire situation, something unexpected happened. Napoleon, seeing the United States as a potential ally against Britain, decided to make an unprecedented offer. Instead of just selling New Orleans, a relatively small piece of land that was key for American trade, he offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States. The entire swath of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, an area more than double the size of the United States at the time. For Napoleon, this was a pragmatic decision. He needed money, and quickly. But for Jefferson and the U.S. diplomats, it was an opportunity beyond their wildest expectations. The price? Just $15 million, less than 3 cents an acre. It was an incredible offer, one that would change the face of America forever. The timing was perfect for Napoleon, whose attention was increasingly focused on European affairs. For the U.S., it was a moment of both fortune and uncertainty. The Americans had only been authorized to buy New Orleans, but the deal on the table was far larger. This sudden offer from Napoleon was an unexpected windfall that put Jefferson and his team in a difficult position. Should they take it? The consequences of their decision would be profound, not just for their time, but for the future of the United States. When the French offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million in 1803, it was a stunning development for the American diplomats negotiating in Paris. Robert Livingston, the U.S. minister to France, and James Monroe, who had been sent as a special envoy to assist with the negotiations, were caught off guard. They had been tasked with securing the port of New Orleans, which was critical for American trade and access to the Mississippi River. However, they found themselves facing an unprecedented opportunity to purchase a vast expanse of land that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. The offer was beyond anything they had been instructed to consider. The diplomats initially struggled to comprehend the offer. The price of $15 million was an enormous sum, equivalent to roughly $300 million in today's dollars, and it represented a chance to secure not only New Orleans, but a massive territory that would nearly double the size of the United States. The land encompassed more than 828,000 square miles, a vast and largely unexplored area that held immense agricultural and economic potential. However, Livingston and Monroe had received clear instructions from President Jefferson to focus solely on the port of New Orleans, which was essential for American farmers and merchants. The idea of purchasing an entire territory, which would involve far-reaching consequences for the future of the Republic, was not part of their mandate. Faced with this unexpected opportunity, Livingston and Monroe were torn. On one hand, the purchase of Louisiana would secure the strategic port of New Orleans, ensuring that the United States would never again be at the mercy of a foreign power, controlling such a vital trade route. It would also eliminate the threat of French influence in the region, a prospect that had long concerned Jefferson. On the other hand, the diplomats were aware that the offer was not just about New Orleans. It was about the future of the nation. Purchasing Louisiana would open up vast new territories for settlement, agriculture, and trade, but it would also raise significant questions about the constitutionality of such a move. Jefferson had always adhered to a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and there was no clear provision that authorized the president to make such a large-scale territorial acquisition. As Livingston and Monroe deliberated, they weighed the immediate benefits against the long-term implications. The opportunity to secure such a vast and valuable territory could be a game-changer for the United States. Yet, the prospect of overstepping their authority and acting beyond the instructions they had received made the decision more complicated. Ultimately, after much deliberation and communication with President Jefferson, the diplomats decided to seize the opportunity. They recognized that the purchase would benefit the country in the long run, even if it meant taking actions that stretched the boundaries of presidential authority. In the end, the Louisiana Purchase was an unexpected and fortuitous moment in American history. Despite the initial shock, the decision to purchase the land was a bold and decisive move that would have profound effects on the nation's future. It secured control of New Orleans, guaranteed access to the Mississippi River, and laid the foundation for the westward expansion of the United States. The $15 million price tag, though substantial, was seen as a bargain for such a vast and strategically significant territory. The deal marked a turning point in the development of the United States, shaping the nation's growth for generations to come. The offer was so good that despite their initial shock, the diplomats knew they had to act. Napoleon's terms were clear and generous. For the price of $15 million, the U.S. would gain not just New Orleans but the entire Louisiana Territory. This was an astonishing deal, effectively doubling the size of the country overnight. The American envoys, aware of the unprecedented nature of this offer, immediately made their decision. They didn't have the authority to agree to such a vast purchase, but the opportunity was too good to let slip by. The negotiations moved quickly, and on April 30th, 1803, the Louisiana Purchase Treaty was signed. Back in the United States, the news of the deal created a wave of excitement and celebration. Americans saw it as a massive victory, an expansion, of land that would give their growing nation the resources it needed to thrive. The westward expansion dream that Jefferson and many others had hoped for was suddenly within reach. It was a moment of national pride and optimism. However, not everyone was thrilled. Jefferson, despite his desire for the land, found himself in a moral and constitutional quandary. As a strict constructionist, he had long believed that the Constitution should be followed to the letter, and it was unclear if the document gave the president the power to purchase foreign land. The U.S. Constitution did grant the president the power to make treaties, but buying land from a foreign nation wasn't explicitly mentioned. Jefferson agonized over whether this was a step too far, fearing that he might be violating his own political philosophy. But in the end, Jefferson made a pragmatic decision. He justified the purchase by framing it as part of his treaty-making power, an executive privilege that allowed him to enter agreements with foreign nations. He argued that securing the future of the nation was worth bending the constitutional rules, and that the Louisiana Territory would benefit the country for generations to come. Ultimately, Jefferson's decision reflected a moment of flexibility in his strict adherence to the Constitution, prioritizing the long-term benefits of the nation over his personal ideological stance. The signing of the treaty was just the beginning of a new chapter in American history. The deal was not without controversy, but the Louisiana Purchase marked a turning point that would set the stage for the nation's expansion and transformation. The American frontier was now open in ways few could have ever imagined, and the door to the west had been thrown wide open, an opportunity that no one would ever let go to waste. The Louisiana Purchase was a vast and transformative acquisition, 828,000 square miles of land, stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains. This was an area larger than the combined territories of many countries in Europe, and it would eventually form the foundation of a significant portion of the United States. To fully grasp the scale of the purchase, imagine a piece of land so large that it would later become home to 15 different states. The newly acquired territory included present-day Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and parts of many others, including North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. The purchase didn't just add land, it opened up vast tracts of land rich in resources, fertile for farming, and ready for settlement. This land would later become central to the development of the American economy, culture, and identity. The acquisition of these lands had immediate and far-reaching consequences for the United States. It secured control over the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans, which had been vital for trade and commerce, particularly for settlers in the western frontier. It also created a perfect canvas for the United States to begin its westward expansion, a movement that would shape the nation's future for decades to come. The notion of manifest destiny, believing that the U.S. was destined to expand from coast to coast, was now within reach. The land itself was varied, with dense forests, vast plains, and rugged mountains, making it incredibly rich in natural resources. This made the territory invaluable for both farming and resource extraction. The fertile soil of the Missouri and Mississippi valleys would be ideal for agriculture, while the western regions would provide untapped resources, including timber, minerals, and fertile grazing lands. This land would become a canvas for American settlers, who flooded into the newly acquired territory in waves. Over the years, towns, cities, and eventually states would rise from the wilderness, each shaping the future of the United States. The purchase didn't just secure land, it set in motion the expansionist vision that would drive the American frontier for much of the 19th century. The Louisiana Purchase was indeed much more than a simple land deal. It was a pivotal moment in the history of the United States, laying the groundwork for a new era of American growth, ambition, and, inevitably, conflict. When the United States acquired the vast territory from France in 1803, it wasn't merely a matter of expanding the nation's borders. It was about seizing the potential to shape the future of the country in ways that would resonate for generations. Economics, impact, and growth. One of the immediate benefits of the Louisiana Purchase was its dramatic impact on the U.S. economy. The acquisition provided access to new resources, fertile land and waterways, particularly the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans, which were vital for trade. Farmers and merchants, especially those in the western frontier, gained secure access to these crucial trade routes. The purchase helped secure the agricultural backbone of the nation, which was still in its infancy, by opening up vast tracts of land for settlement and farming. With the added territory, the U.S. was poised to become a dominant agricultural power. The land was ideal for cultivating crops like cotton, tobacco, and grain, which would become the economic staples of the South and the economy as a whole. New industries also began to develop as the country expanded westward, creating jobs, building infrastructure, and fueling economic growth. The acquisition essentially opened up the American frontier, allowing settlers and entrepreneurs to build new towns, cities, and trade hubs across vast new regions. Social shifts and migration. The Louisiana Purchase also spurred a dramatic shift in the nation's demographic makeup. As settlers poured into the newly acquired territories, they brought with them new ideas, cultures, and ways of life. The westward movement became a symbol of American ambition, with the promise of a better life attracting thousands of individuals seeking land, opportunity, and freedom. Over time, this migration would lead to the creation of new states and the expansion of American society in ways that would redefine its character. However, this movement was not without its consequences. The territorial expansion resulted in the displacement of Native American tribes, whose ancestral lands were now being overtaken by settlers. Tensions between Native Americans and settlers, as well as the U.S. government, began to rise during this period, setting the stage for future conflicts like the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears. The purchase also intensified the debate over slavery, as new territories opened up for settlement, sparking questions about whether slavery would be allowed to expand into these new areas. Political implications and national identity. Politically, the Louisiana Purchase created a foundation for a new sense of American identity. The acquisition provided the United States with an incredible strategic advantage: control of the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans, which were crucial for both national security and economic prosperity. The purchase also demonstrated the U.S.'s growing power on the world stage, showing that it could negotiate and secure large, valuable territories. It signaled to both European powers and Americans themselves that the United States was an emerging force capable of securing its interests and expanding its influence. Yet, the Louisiana Purchase also sparked debates over the interpretation of the Constitution. President Jefferson, a strict constructionist, had always argued for a limited federal government, but the purchase of Louisiana tested those limits. Jefferson's decision to move forward with the deal, despite constitutional concerns, represented a shift in his political thinking, one that would later influence the expansion of executive power and the role of the federal government in shaping the nation's destiny. The purchase also underscored the growing tension between the nation's different regions. While the expansion of the United States was seen as a triumph by many, others were concerned about how the new lands would be governed and whether slavery would spread to the new territories. These questions would continue to divide the country for decades, culminating in the Civil War. Legacy of the Louisiana Purchase. Ultimately, the Louisiana Purchase laid the foundation for the emergence of the United States as a continental power. It sparked the country's westward expansion, which would continue for much of the 19th century. The purchase directly shaped the nation's economy, social structure, political landscape, and national identity. It introduced both opportunities and challenges, many of which would define the course of American history. In the long run, the Louisiana Purchase created the framework for a new era of American growth and ambition. It reflected the young nation's desire to control its destiny, to grow and prosper in the face of adversity, and to build a society that, despite the conflicts it would face, would be defined by the notion of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to stretch from coast to coast. In that sense, the Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a land deal, it was a foundational event that shaped the very soul of America. After the United States secured the Louisiana Territory, the next challenge was to explore and map this vast new land. President Jefferson, eager to understand the geography and resources of the newly acquired territory, commissioned an expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission, which spanned from 1804 to 1806, was to chart the unknown regions of the West, establish relations with Native American tribes, and gather scientific knowledge about the plants, animals, and resources of the land. The Lewis and Clark expedition is one of the most iconic in American history. It set out from St. Louis in May 1804, traveling up the Missouri River, across the Rocky Mountains, and finally reaching the Pacific Ocean in 1805. Along the way, they mapped the terrain, recorded new species of plants and animals, and brought back valuable information about the land's potential for settlement and expansion. They also made contact with numerous Native American tribes, including the Mandan, Nez Perce, and Shoshone, many of whom provided vital assistance during their journey. The expedition was a success in many ways. It offered a wealth of scientific discoveries, including detailed maps of the West, and helped to fuel interest in the possibilities of settling the region. The documentation of the land's vast potential, its fertile soil, rivers, and natural resources, made it clear that this new territory could support a rapidly growing nation. In fact, the expedition planted the seeds for future exploration, trade routes, and eventually, the settlement of the American West. However, the expansion also had darker consequences. As Americans moved into the Louisiana Territory, tensions with Native American tribes began to rise. Many of the tribes that had lived on the land for centuries were now confronted with the reality of American settlers encroaching on their territories. The U.S. government, eager to secure land for settlers, began to pressure Native nations into ceding their lands through treaties or force. What followed was a series of conflicts and displacements, as the federal government pushed forward with its plans for westward expansion. The idea of manifest destiny, belief in the U.S. destiny to expand across the continent, began to take root around this time. The Louisiana Purchase had given America the land, and now the nation's mindset was shifting towards seeing this land as rightfully theirs to develop and control. This belief would drive the next decades of American history, leading to the forced removal of Native Americans from their ancestral lands, the rise of frontier settlements, and the eventual push all the way to the Pacific coast. While the Louisiana Purchase opened new opportunities for settlers, it also set the stage for complex challenges. The quest to settle the new land, expand the economy, and secure borders would not be a peaceful endeavor, and the consequences of American expansionism would reverberate for generations. The exploration of the West, while a source of pride for the young nation, was also the beginning of a series of events that would define the nation's character in ways both ambitious and tragic. The Louisiana Purchase was far more than just a land deal. It was a defining moment in the history of the United States, one that would shape the country's identity and trajectory for centuries to come. The acquisition of over 828,000 square miles not only doubled the size of the nation, but set the stage for America's transformation from a fledgling republic into a continental power. In the immediate aftermath, the United States was no longer confined to the narrow strip of land along the Atlantic coast. With the Louisiana Territory, the nation suddenly had room to grow westward, and this vast expanse became a cornerstone of the American identity. The idea of westward expansion, of settling the frontier and spreading American ideals, began to take root. It fueled a belief in manifest destiny, the conviction that it was the United States' divine right and destiny to expand across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This vision of an ever-growing America, with its economic prosperity and political influence, became an intrinsic part of the nation's character. As settlers moved west, cities, towns, and communities began to spring up across the new lands. The fertile plains of Missouri, the vast grasslands of Kansas and Nebraska, and the mineral-rich lands of Colorado and Montana became the backbone of the American economy. Cities like St. Louis, Kansas City, and Denver, once small outposts, grew into major urban centers as trade routes were established, and new industries like farming, mining, and later railroads took hold. The development of these areas became vital to the country's growth, and the Louisiana Purchase played a major role in turning the U.S. into an agricultural and industrial powerhouse. However, the legacy of the Louisiana Purchase is not without its darker side, particularly when it comes to its impact on Native American communities. As settlers moved into the newly acquired territory, the native tribes who had lived on these lands for centuries were faced with displacement, violence, and loss of their traditional ways of life. While some tribes initially attempted to engage in peaceful trade and negotiations, many others found themselves in conflict with American settlers and the government, which was intent on securing more and more land for expansion. The U.S. government began a systematic campaign to remove native populations through treaties, many of which were coercive or outright fraudulent, and forceful relocations, like the infamous Trail of Tears, would follow. The Louisiana Purchase marked the beginning of a long, painful chapter for Native Americans. Their land was taken, their cultures were disrupted, and many tribes were forced onto reservations. The impact of the purchase on these communities was profound, and it would take generations for Native nations to begin recovering from the loss of their homelands and sovereignty. At the same time, the Louisiana Purchase sowed the seeds for future conflict within the United States. As new states were carved out of the territory, questions arose about whether they would allow slavery, which led to fierce political battles and regional tensions. These tensions, combined with the displacement of Native peoples, would eventually contribute to the eruption of the Civil War in the 1860s, as the nation was forced to confront the issue of slavery and its expansion into new territories. In the long term, the Louisiana Purchase also paved the way for the creation of the American Transcontinental Railroad, which further connected the East to the West and solidified the U.S. as a continental nation. The growth of industry, trade, and infrastructure in the Western territories, bolstered by the acquisition of the land, would be essential to the nation's economic development. In the end, the Louisiana Purchase was a turning point that not only defined the shape of the United States, but also cast a long shadow over its history. It sparked a wave of expansion and growth, but also set in motion deep and often painful conflicts, some of which are still being addressed today. The legacy of the Purchase is a complex one, full of ambition, opportunity, and tragedy. It was the beginning of America's rise to power, but it also marked the beginning of a struggle that would define much of the country's history. As we've seen, the Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a simple land deal. It was a monumental, event that reshaped the United States and set the stage for much of its future growth and conflict. From the negotiations with France to the exploration by Lewis and Clark to the westward expansion that followed, this single purchase transformed the nation in ways no one could have predicted at the time. The land it brought into the U.S. was rich in resources, vital to economic growth, and instrumental in creating the idea of a nation destined to stretch across the continent. But it also ignited conflicts with Native American tribes and set the stage for the divisions over slavery, which would eventually lead to the Civil War. The legacy of the Louisiana Purchase is a blend of opportunity and tragedy, growth and loss, shaping the U.S. into the country we know today. So I'll leave you with this question. Do you think the U.S. would be what it is today without the Louisiana Purchase? Would the country have grown as rapidly? Could it have become a continental power? Or would the lack of this territory have led to a very different trajectory for the nation? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Be sure to like this video, comment below with your perspective, and subscribe for more untold stories of history. Until next time, stay curious.